So now we're back in our Dark Knight cave. At the very beginning, believe me, we're going to get through this pretty quickly once we get up and running. But now we have this problem where we can see our texture and it's very clearly tiling across our entire surface. So if we double click this material instance, we're going to have our material instance settings. Now if we scroll to the bottom, we can see that this has a Megascans surface material template. And one thing I like to do is I like to set these either to a plane or a cube. Cube just lets you see each side individually. And if we look here, we can see that our object is tiling in a very perfect way across our entire floor. So the first thing that we can do is we'll want to change our global tiling. So tiling is an X and Y. If we just drag this, we can see that it stretches it out in one direction or another. So if I set it higher, it's going to tile more frequently. If I set it lower, it's going to tile less frequently. So off the bat, I'm going to set this to 0.25 in the X and the Y. And we can see that already this looks quite a bit better, but especially when you're looking down long corridors, you can start to see some of that repeating over and over again. So a really simple way to avoid this without doing any complicated shader math is by adding a rotation angle. So rotation angle is between 0 and 1, where 0 is 0 and 1 is 360. So if I set this to 1, it's going to look like there's no difference. If I set it to 0.5, it's going to do a 180 degree rotation. So if I set this to 0.25, it'll be a 90 degree rotation. But if we set it on sort of an off axis number, something like 0.15, we can see that this starts to break up how this is tiled. If we rotate our camera, we'll start to see that same reoccurring tiling. But like I said, if we're in a long corridor, oftentimes this will do the trick just to get us started. Now that we've stretched our material, if we get up close to our mannequin here, we can see that our ground is actually pretty low res, and this is because now we've tiled it up a bunch. So let's take a look at how to update our textures and convert them from 2K textures up to 4K resolution. Any Quixel asset you download is going to have a 7-letter key at the back here. So we have VLXLEIV. So if I type this in, VLXLEIV, and I hit enter, this should bring up the exact surface we had before. So now if I click on this, and I want to update this from medium quality to high quality, we're going to have to download our material again, and then add it to our scene. Now we're going to have two sets of textures, and it'll label it 4K here instead of the 2K texture. And you can keep both in your scene, but usually I like to delete the previous one, the 2K version, just to make sure that we're not confused. So I'm going to remove these, and I'm going to open up our new material. So now if we enter the same settings, we set the tiling to 0.25, and we set our rotation angle to 0.158. Now we can swap out our material. All right. And now when we look at our ground, we still have a lot of detail up close. And now that we have this really high res floor, another thing that we can do is we can start to crank our normal strength, especially when we're looking at a light. You can see how smooth it looks here and how much extra detail we get by setting it to 5. So now let's create our walls. I'm going to go to the quick add actors menu where we have some primitives here. So we have cube, spheres, cylinder, cone, and plane. Use these a lot, especially when blocking out a level. We'd want to make this about 9 feet tall, like a typical ceiling would be. So we can set this to about 2.5, let's say. We go here and press the end key so it snaps to the ground. And then let's make these a little bit thinner. And let's drag these out so that they can exist on our walls. And we'll set this to 1,000 here. We'll zero out our x-axis. And now we can scale this to reach the 2,000 units that is our wall. Cool. So now we've scaled that out. So you'll see in a bit, Lumen works best when objects completely intersect with each other. It does a good job most of the time when they border on each other, but sometimes it's good to give it a little extra nudge. So I'm just going to scale this up vertically. Otherwise, it could just sink it into the floor just a little bit more. But let's keep it right there. All right, so we have our wall here. Let's duplicate it and make the opposite side of the wall. And then let's just add our back wall. And we'll set this to 3,000 units in the x-axis. We'll rotate it 90 degrees. Another reason why keeping snapping on most of the time, especially in this layout phase, is fairly helpful. And we'll set our Y to 0. Now, one thing to notice here, this scale lock is on. And what happens here, if I change our x-axis to 20, which would just cut this in half, we can tell on the red x-axis that that's the axis that we would need to scale down on to make this less wide. So I'd set it to something like 20. But if this lock is on, it's going to scale every single dimension. So it's going to scale our y dimension and our z dimension. So if I undo that, in this case, I would want to uncheck the lock and just scale it on the x-axis. And then we keep our height, we keep our width of the wall, and everything's working as we'd expect. And then we'll just duplicate this one more time and add our back wall as well. All right, so now let's grab our worn painted wall material and drag that onto our wall. And now you can see, because we stretched this out so much, or 40 times wider on our x-axis, now this is reflected in the texture. So we can open this up and we'll need to change our tiling in the opposite way. So if we want this to tile more frequently, we would want to increase the tiling, and it's 40 times bigger. So let's just set this to 4 and see where that gets us. And we can see here, it's not so bad. So we could also reduce our tiling in Y to something like this, like 0.5. And this will start to stretch out our texture in a way that at least looks correct in terms of the scale of the world. But again, we have that same problem where we have these clear, large artifacts that are repeating throughout our wall. Oftentimes, it can be helpful to pick materials that have more subtle features. If they have large features like this, it makes the tiling become very, very obvious. But we can do the same trick with our rotation angle, and we'll just start to drag this until it does remove some of that tiling. Another option we have is we can offset this in the X and Y. This happens before the rotations. So now that I've rotated, it's going to offset at an axis. But from here, we can start to dial in the look of the tiling of our material. Right, but now if we look back at our example of what we're trying to create here, again, always want to look back at the reference. We can see a couple things. One, we can see that our wall up here is pretty bright and contrasty. In this example, the floor is actually brighter than the walls. One reason for that is that the light is hitting it more directly, but still, right now, our wall is brighter than our floor. So now let's start adjusting the albedo color of our textures. So if we go to the albedo settings, we have our albedo tint and we have our albedo controls. Oftentimes, setting these controls first is a good idea. We want this to read as gray concrete, so I'm going to desaturate this a little bit. If we go to our unlit mode, we can see that these are actually fairly gray. They're really just looking a bit yellow because of the color of our sun. As you can see on our mannequin here as well, he's almost perfectly gray in our viewport, but if we go back to lit mode, he does appear to be yellow just because of the sun. So now we could set the brightness to be a lot lower. But as we set that lower, we can see we still get a lot of contrast out of the darkest darks here and the whitest whites. And again, if we look back at our example, other than a few spots, it's a pretty flat gray. So one thing that I'll do here is I'll set this contrast to 0.5. Typically, when you decontrast something or reduce the contrast, it will make it brighter. So you'll usually have to compensate by making it darker as well. So the more you decrease that contrast, it's not surprising to have to set this brightness to something very low, like 0.05 or even lower. So it's usually good to check this in unlit mode, and we can see that 0.05 is probably a pretty good brightness level for us in this case. But keep in mind, these are very context dependent and really depend on the albedo image that's being input in the first place. And now we want to flip these. We want our ground to be a little more blue and we want our walls to be a bit more yellow. So we can just take our color picker here and start dragging it towards yellow. We just want to inch it. If we go too extreme, it'll start to look very unrealistic very quickly. And we can drag it here. A couple things to know about this color picker. We have our saturation here. So our saturation is represented on this slider here, but we are literally, these are doing the same exact thing, whether you drag it here or click it on this visual slider. So whatever is easier for you to understand. You can see there's also a saturation bar there. And the same goes for value. Value is just another term for brightness. So same thing, the darker we get there or on our slider, the darker our material will appear. And if you just want to change the hue or want to rotate it around the wheel, but you want to keep the saturation the same, that's what that hue control is for. So that's another useful slider if you just want to change the color itself, but not the brightness or the saturation. So we'll press OK there. And now let's tint our floor. So I'm going to double click on that material instance. Now we have the same albedo controls here. So here we want it to be more blue. So if we want to keep our value the same, but we want it to be more blue, we can reduce our red and green value. So if we set this to 0.5 in the red and 0.5 in the green, we can see that that's now made it too blue and almost purple. So then if we pop this open, we can just reduce our saturation to something like 0.1, where we're just starting to inch it. And we'll make this a little bit darker so they line up. And it is pretty subtle here, but now we can see that our wall here has gone a little bit green compared to our blue floor there. So now we'll just take this and we'll pull out just a little bit of green so it has a warmer, sandier tone. And there we go. For now, that should do the trick. Our floor is a little bit brighter, our wall is a little bit darker. Now let's make sure to apply this material to our other walls here. So I'm going to click on the Browse button. And now that pops up in our content browser. And now when I click on this wall, I can just hit the Use Selected Asset from Content Browser, and it's going to know to grab that material. And now if I apply it to this back material as well, the tiling is going to be scrunched up when compared to this because this is twice as wide as our back wall here. Honestly, I don't think we'll notice it, but you would just take that same material, duplicate it, and make another instance, and we'll change this to the number 2 variant. Let's make sure that we're actually using this material on the back wall. And because we've used our pre-existing template, and we can set our tiling from 5 to 2.5, and now it should have roughly the same tiling between our walls on the side here and our wall on the back. But we do have this repeating texture here, so now I'll just offset this in our X to make that a little bit less obvious. Great.